title of my message is The LCMS Religious Liberty Efforts in the Political Experiment That Is America. And I'm Gregory Seltz, and I approve of this message. Aren't you tired of hearing that, right? I mean, we're finally through the political season, and I do have to tell you, what's so amazing is I was there when Donald Trump was there the first time, and now the second time. The biggest issue for me is not so much his leadership, although that's important, obviously. It's what happens with the agencies and all the appointments. And most of the people that are going to be appointed are going to be at least people who care about the church. For the last 4 years, it's been people who can't stand the church. And we've literally had to try to be standing in the gap to push back on those kinds of things. Because the only reason why we're in Washington, this is my last plug, is we're there to protect you. We're there to protect your public voice so you can be the church in the public square and proclaim the whole counsel of God without fear of government, coercion, or intimidation. To the contrary. That is the only reason I'm there. We're trying to take politics out of a lot of these issues so you can share with your neighbor across the fence, and you can be a good neighbor with people with whom you disagree. That's all we want. But we're dealing with folks on the Hill who want to politicize everything, which means they want to shut the church out of even being evangelists to their neighbors. All right, so we are this two kingdom. And when I say two kingdoms, I just mean it very simply. God is at work, but he works two different ways. He works to preserve the world. He works to save the world. And we need to differentiate that. And that's about the simplest definition I give anywhere I go. It's not us. It's God at work. He preserves. He saves. Learn how to differentiate that. And so I start with this quote from Gene V. He says, thus God has a spiritual rule in the hearts and lives of Christians. He also has a secular rule that extends throughout his creation in every culture. He reigns in the church through the gospel, the proclamation of forgiveness and the cross of Christ, a message which kindles faith and inward transformation in the believer. Notice, transformation doesn't come through politics. He reigns in the world through his law, and he curbs there, which he calls human societies to justice and righteousness. You know, a friend of mine, I was talking about what I was wanting to speak with you about today. He said, well, tell them this joke. So I'm going to start off with the joke. Here it comes. There was a surgeon, an engineer, and a politician who were arguing as to which one of the professions was older. The surgeon said, surely it's mine because God did surgery on Adam to produce Eve. Well, the engineer didn't like that. He said, yeah, but before the creation of Adam and Eve, the chaos was made into order. So making order out of chaos, that's the work of an engineer. We came first. And finally, the politician chimed in. He said, yeah, but who made the chaos? Now, when you think about this, you know, ironically, the very point of government is to do what? To prevent all hell from breaking loose. It's God's actually emergency organization that comes after the fall in Genesis 9, because the human beings got so sinful, they actually started killing each other. So therefore, God creates good government and says this far and no farther when it comes to your outward sinful behavior. And yet in the work I do on the Hill, that's about the one thing that they don't seem to be doing lately. In my work in urban ministry, that was my biggest issue. Was how come you don't do the main work that the government's supposed to do, which is to protect the good folks and punish the bad ones? That is the issue in the pro-life movement, folks. It's about government protecting innocent life, or government saying, you know what, there's certain innocent life that's not worth living, and you can dispense with it as you will. Well, if they start with the kids in the womb, they usually don't stop. That's what we're all about on the Hill. A lot of the work that we deal with on the Hill, they're actually creating chaos, whether it's abortion, infanticide, gender confusion, or they're undermining the family, which is God's trinity of civility, father, mother, and child. And they're even literally demanding that the government do benevolencing things, as if they can, taking the place of family, taking the place of church. And it's neither created, commanded, or capable of doing. You know, one of the things, and we've had a nice slide up here in this one, but one of the things that I think is perplexing the church is there's a Christian heresy out there called benevolent government. That's an oxymoron. There is no such thing. Government is always coercive. There's benevolent families, benevolent people, benevolent citizens, Benevolent, free people in service to each other. There is no such thing as a coercive government that benevolence is. And yet a lot of our kids actually believe it's true. Now, the second thing that I love to tell, this is again, it's always good to start your speech with something from Chesterton, a little bit satirical. And this is I think this is my view of government too, what we're dealing with. He said, the whole world is divided into conservatives and progressives. The business of progressives is to go on making huge mistakes. The business of conservatives is to prevent the mistakes from being corrected. And in a lot of ways, that could be what's coming on. We struggle on the Hill because we say, why did we let those guys get away with doing all this stuff? And then we elect these other guys, and they seem to conserve whatever is going on at the moment. Well, I hope to say that this moment in time will be a little bit different. Again, when I think about our role on the Hill, it's limiting government. It's actually beginning to address these things to deal with the challenges that we have, so that we can actually put the government in its place so that you can serve without fear. So this evening, what I really want to do with you tonight is I want to encourage you to begin to realize that as a church, we have a role to play, obviously, in the mission work of the church and sharing the good news of the gospel. We also have a role to play in the civilizing of our culture. God has actually called us to be fruitful and multiply and refresh and replenish the earth. There is a civil command for us to be useful in his hands for the sake of the culture, as well as for the sake of the mission and the church. Now, civilizing the culture will not save us. I understand that. But it will prevent all hell from breaking loose in the culture. I always said it this way in my urban work: it's tough to share the gospel when all hell is breaking loose. It's tough to share the gospel in a failed state. I had guys that I trained for urban church planting mission work who came from Vietnam when Vietnam fell, or came from Venezuela when Venezuela. It's hard to share the gospel when you're running for your lives. So we'll look tonight at different ways that we in history actually adapted to these challenges in America. And then we'll take up the modern challenge at the very end that I think is facing us today. Now, if we don't do this, especially in the American experiment, because what's amazing about America is that the founders said the citizens are the key to America and freedom, not the leaders, the citizens. If we will not do this, someone else will take our place. And I believe those that are seeking to take that place will do it to the detriment not only of society, but also to the gospel. How do I know this? I've seen the policies. The Equality Act, the Respect for Marriage Act, all of those things will eventually criminalize the teachings of the church. I call them secular blasphemy laws. They're already happening in Europe. They'll come here unless we push back on those things. I've seen the Title IX abuses that are proffered through the EEOC, and I've seen them coming. They're coming for our preschools and our schools and eventually our churches, unless we bring some sanity back in culture. All right, so let's set the stage about our history in engaging all of these things. Now, historically, again, when you think about the Lutheran Church and its two kingdoms, what we're saying is we have to differentiate God's preserving and his saving work, just like the law and gospel. I mean, they're both God's word, but you have to properly differentiate how they are to be used. It's the same thing with God's work through things like the state and things like the church. What I think that allows us to do is it allows us to get involved in these cultural things without politicizing the gospel. And it also gives us the ability to differentiate God's preserving work in such a way that we can adapt to different challenges in the culture without changing our theology or our proclamation. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But properly differentiating Caesar's work, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. When you start to properly differentiate that, then you can actually be excellent both in God's left-hand kingdom preserving work and excellent in his serving work because you start asking the right questions. One of the things that I thought about was, in Paul's day, Paul had that ability to use his Roman citizenship. You remember the example when he was actually beat up in Ephesus and he said, you're not going to do that to me because I'm a Roman citizen. But in reality, he was a Roman subject. So when he said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, well, what happens when Caesar's on top? You just try to keep your head down. You try to be a good citizen. You try to have the protection. But the last thing you want to do is mess with Caesar, because he can do a lot of bad things to you. And you just want to live in peace, and you want to live in quiet, like First Timothy talks about. I think what we need to start to understand in America is when we say give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's, the application is that you, the citizen, are Caesar. How would you pray, Pastor? If you're praying for those who are an authority above you, who would you pray for? Give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God what is God's. Actually, I think if we pray this properly in America, then we should be praying for moms and dads, because they're the highest authority in constitutional America. Everybody else is a derived authority underneath them. The governor, he's the one who cuts your grass. The mayor, he's the one who tends your garden, because you're the Caesar of your home. So pray for moms and dads. And that's one of the reasons why, if you notice that some of the problems we have in policy, they're actually undermining parental rights. They know that the moms and dads really are on top in constitutional law. So I think it's an amazing thing where you talk about this American experiment that we've been given, citizens as Caesar, politicians as referees. We just had an election. Honestly, I try to explain to people over and over again. One side literally was saying the government has control of every aspect of your life from cradle to grave. And the other side was saying, no, they don't. And that was the main issue on the election. All right, so let's talk about how we as America, as Lutherans, engaged in this American experiment. Let's go all the way back to 1839. I said the title that was going to be again on my slide was, in a benign, even faithful Caesar culture, you can keep your head down. And that's in a lot of ways how our founding fathers came to America. The Saxons, when they came here, remember the history of that, right? The history was they suddenly were running afoul of the Prussian government, and the government was actually telling them what to do in worship, what to sing in worship, how to do their liturgies. Why do you think LCMS people are so committed to their hymns? It's because they had one shoved down their throat by the government in Germany. Now, back in those particular days, usually had to just grin and bear it, except for our Saxon founders. They actually had another choice. They could get on a boat and they could emigrate. They could come to America. So that's what they did. And so when they got to America, what was an amazing thing was they got here because there was religious liberty here. They could actually do the things that they wanted to do back in their homeland. They could do them faithfully here. And so they came to America, they established themselves, they built their seminaries, they built their schools, they built their hospitals, they took care of one another, and they kept their heads down. I read this quote, it's from Daniel Rankin, who said it this way. The Lutherans, the Missouri Synod Lutherans, are an ethnic group, not by virtue of their language retention, food ways, or any obvious German way, but rather through a consistent pattern of doctrinal and liturgical conservatism based on their beliefs about the nature of Lutheranism as taught by Luther and their Saxon forefathers. We were an isolated, ethnocentric, we took care of our own business, self-sufficient people. And that actually, in a lot of ways, was a good thing. Because in America, we were allowed to do that because we were allowed to be free. Now, as I look back on that, that ability to actually keep our heads down and just be good citizens, we actually resisted some of the millenarianism and the kinds of things that were going on in America. There was a lot of this talk of New Jerusalem, New Zion on the hill, as if America was a fulfillment of prophecy. We still see that in Israel with some of the folks that are talking about Israel and the land prophecies today with the evangelical church. We resisted all of that. In fact, we go back to one of our founding documents, a brief statement by Franz Pieper. We reject that notion because we were here to be faithful to God, to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ, and to be good citizens in this American experiment. So, in one sense, we came here like everybody else came to America for religious liberty, and we found it in America. And we found it because the founders of this country said that's the number one thing. There's a First Amendment that protects the church from the government. And they wanted to limit the government and set the faith-motivated, morally directed, self-governing citizen free. And they wanted to see what that kind of freedom could do in this particular culture. The second thing that we were known for in this early period, and I would say it's the first 75 years of our history here, and this is what we were talking about on the table, is that we also were a Hamlet people. And I didn't really know what that was. I did study this in my PhD. As a Hamlet people, Germans came to places, whether it was America, Brazil, Australia, and all they wanted was freedom. They did everything else. They established their communities. They established their schools. They established their hospitals. They took care of one another. They built beer gardens. Do you know about this? And do you know the difference between the Germans and the Irish? The Germans actually built beer gardens and they brought their families there, and these were celebratory places where they sang songs. The Irish built pubs where they drank hard liquor and fought. The Irish and the Germans did not get along because of that. You know, I had to actually find out about our heritage by reading a guy named Thomas Sowell. Does anybody know who Thomas Sowell is? Yeah, there's a great book called Ethnic America. You ought to read it, because I had to actually read it to find out that Germans are really pretty fun people. Because I had grown up hearing it, they're like this, and they're always, no, he said they were fun people. They brought joy, they brought beer gardens, they brought song, they even brought bowling to America. Yes. But they literally brought all these different things, and they brought family, and they never asked anything of the cultures in which they immigrated or emigrated to, because they took care of it themselves. And that's why all over the world, people used to love to welcome the Germans. I thought that's something pretty cool. Now that's an incredible immigration story. It's a terrible evangelist story to keep to oneself. But Sowell actually writes in his book, he said, we were known, he said they had a reputation for hard work, thoroughness, thriftiness, as well as singing and joy. Well, we kept our head down. Now, you might ask, why would we do such a thing when we got to America and had all these freedoms? I suppose they were probably still suffering from what they experienced in Prussia, from Prussia with love. They didn't want to get too close to the government because they saw what government could do to them. So even in America with all those freedoms, they kept their heads down. But things began to change. In a growing, secularizing, transgressive state, Caesar now looks askance at the confessing church, and we started to see a change about World War I and World War II, especially with the German Lutherans, right? Because now, you know, we were keeping to ourselves. Suddenly, World War I, World War II, the protagonists are Germans, and now they speak that funny language, and they don't assimilate, and they're so isolated. And the first thing that happened, the Supreme Court case Meyer versus Nebraska. I always thought this was amazing. In 1923, Nebraska sued us because they were watching us, these isolated folks who, before we, for the last 75 years, we thought they're the most wonderful neighbors to have. Now they speak that funny language and they won't change. And we're battling them in World War I and World War II. Who are these people? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. In German, I think that's what, Kaiser. And so pastors were starting to get harassed just like back in the old country. And they even sued us. But we won. We went all the way to the Supreme Court and we said our home language and our faith language, we can do that and still be good Americans. And we won. So don't tell me that we can't speak to folks who are Hispanic today, who want to speak Spanish in their homes and in their churches, but they need to speak English so they can succeed in America. We know about that. We participated in that reality. We went all the way to the Supreme Court to prove it. But we got set apart and we got harassed, first of all, for being German. It's an amazing thing about Lutherans is that when we finally get pushed to the brink, we stay. We say this far and no farther. Now, the second thing, though, that was probably most definitive for us in our middle history was the FCC scrutiny of Walter Meyer. Do you know who Walter Meyer is? He's my hero and I wish more people knew about him. It's the actual reason why I'm in Washington, because Walter Maier did two things. One, he was the Lutheran speaker, and he was the most popular popular Christian speaker in America during his time. But you know what else Walter Maier was? He was a First Amendment citizen who fought for the rights of all Christians to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ without fear for government coercion. Well, how did that happen? Well, what happened was at the height of his success, I think it was in the early 40s, the FCC, actually some progressive folks and some liberal Christians attacked Walter Maier, said he preached too much about Jesus on the radio. You know, let's have a radio program about morality. Let's have a radio program about ethics. Let's have that kind of program, but none of this Jesus, only Jesus. And so they tried to kick him off the air. And I always ask people, what should Walter Maier do? Because I hear people say today we should get involved in politics. What should he have done? If he did nothing, they probably would have ruled against him and there would be no Lutheran. But he fought back. And he didn't fight back quoting the scripture to the FCC. He fought back using Jeffersonian freedom principles of the First Amendment. And he actually protected not only the Lutheran from that kind of over-scrutiny, but he also protected all religious radio. We jumped in. Walter Maier is a great example of God's two-kingdom engagement of the world for the sake of the gospel. But in this early particular period, in this middle period, two things are highlighted. One, when we got pushed to the brink and we were told to assimilate and we were told to get on board, we said, no, we want to be who we are in this American experiment. That's actually a good thing. That's actually a good thing. But secondly, we also understood that there's a broader struggle coming. The secularizing of our culture was coming, even for the church. Well, in the final phase, in the 1960s, I'll just use that as a major date, but there was a lot of things going on long before that. Now we're dealing with what I call an unashamedly proud, secular, transgressive state. They have no problem actually saying, this is who we are. We're not going to be limited to any kind of limitations constitutionally, and we're coming for those who stand in our way. Hitler's final solution was not just that he was going after ethnic Jews. Hitler's final solution was that he was going after people who believed there was a higher authority than the state. Anybody who believes in Genesis is a threat to those who believe in the secular state today. And if you don't believe me, here's a quote from, his name is Robert Reich. You know who I'm talking about? He actually has a thing called, he does this, you got to see it. But John Stossel said, Robert Reich is wrong. So you ought to, Stossel's got his little half-hour things too. But Reich says this, he says the true battle of the 21st century will be between the modern society and the anti-modernists, between those who believe in the primacy of the individuals and those who believe that the human beings owe their allegiance and identity to a higher authority. He goes on to quote some other things, but listen to this last thing. He says, terrorism will destruct and destroy our lives, but it is not the greatest danger we face. You know what the greatest danger is to Robert Reich? The church. Now think that through for a minute. He teaches public policy at Berkeley. He's teaching your children when you go to school there. He's teaching them that the church is the worst organization for our freedoms. He's teaching them that the church has to be knuckled under so that we might reach our utopian ends. I think he's established the battle lines, don't you? And I think we need to push back on that. The kinds of things we've seen in this final phase, we haven't changed our theology. All we're doing is saying we can push back. God's preserving work says that this state needs to go back in its proper place. We've seen this happen with things like the Obergefell and Hodges ruling, where they suddenly changed the definition of marriage. We saw this in the Lemon Law, where actually they started to actually say the church was the problem, not the state. And we, of course, saw this in Roe v. Wade back in the 70s. In fact, when Roe v. Wade became a federal law, did you know that America was actually a pro-life country? We were winning in every state because we were people of life. And so they actually said, we got to federalize this thing. And they took it to the Supreme Court and they undermined it. And so for 50 years, all I've heard over and over again is abortion is a federal thing. Abortion is a constitutional right. No one ever even asks what abortion is. No one even asks what actually the procedure is. By the way, have you ever seen like on public television when they take out the appendix? Have you ever seen any of these things? They'll show you a surgery on public television. Why won't they show an abortion on public television? Why won't they show what it is that we're doing to each other? Because when you can actually dehumanize a child, you can dehumanize an older folk. You can dehumanize an ideological guy that's out of step with the culture. We've seen it happen in every secular movement in the last 100 years. Each of these previous cases demonstrate a hostility towards those who had conscience differences. Each of those cases actually showed a growing hostility, not only to the church, but the biblical worldview in politics and in culture. And so I say at this moment in time, we had to rise to the challenge. Now, in this particular moment, we did. There were two seminal Supreme Court cases, Hosanna Tabor, you remember that one? And then Trinity Lutheran. Hosanna Tabor was, and I interviewed her on my radio program. She was just, I think she was in her 20s when she was the principal. Suddenly she's arguing or being questioned before the Supreme Court of the United States. She said she was scared to death, but she realized they had truth to stand on, and they were going to stand here for the sake of their school. They wound up standing there not only for the sake of Lutheran parochial education, but for all parochial education. That case is the foundational case that still protects every school's right to hire and fire according to the teachings of the church, not the HR department of your organization. And then the one Trinity is really a seminal case too, because now they're really saying is that the church and the parochial schools are doing just like everybody else. You cannot discriminate against them just because they're churches. So again, we've done this before. We saw what Walter Meyer did when he rose to the occasion with the FCC, and then we actually said, let's stand on these principles and let it go all the way to the Supreme Court and see what happens. When I look at the work that I'm doing in Washington, D.C. right now, there's some incredible things that are happening that's good for you and for the church. We have more freedom today than our grandparents had. We have more freedom, more protections than our grandparents had. It's because there's been cases that have been won that have flown, that have actually gone forward from things like Trinity and Hosanna Tabor. The Bladensburg Cross case, for instance, the Boston Flag case, the Coach Kennedy case, all those cases are building on wins that say the church is the protected organization of the First Amendment, and the state has to honor that. Well, in closing then, in the constitutional republic that is today, I guess I would just challenge you to start to see what the Lutheran Church can be as a public entity in the midst of all this. Walter Meyer, he pushes back on the oversight and the scrutiny of the FCC. But he didn't stop there. How many of you know, has anybody ever heard of the National Religious Broadcasters? Do you know what I'm talking about? It's the largest First Amendment organization for radio, TV, and internet in the church today. Do you know who started it? Walter Meyer and a few evangelical leaders. I think it was the 75th anniversary of the NRV a few years ago, and I was able to be there, and the whole first day was them talking about Walter Meyer and the LLL leaders that helped start the organization. We can rise to the occasion now because we have to be more proactive than reactive. We now have a state that actually says they want to take over every aspect of your life. We have to tell them no. The founding fathers got this right. We're going to limit coercive government so we can set people free who are motivated by their faith, morally corrected, and self-government. That's the American experiment, and Christians are the ones who practice that best. We need to actually be useful in God's hands and be proactive in pushing back on that secular state that wants to actually circumvent that so that all people can live in this freedom. And I finally close then with this idea, why am I in Washington, D.C.? Well, the HHS mandate. That's the final event when they actually try to tell us what we could do with abortifacients in our own particular healthcare. President Harrison was called, just like other folks were called, to testify before Congress. And we said, we are not going to be treated as an exemption. We have First Amendment rights and responsibilities and protections because the church is the most important organization. in constitutional America. And we pushed back and we won them. I mean, out of that kind of effort, the LCRO grew, and that's what I do now. And our goal is to actually depoliticize these issues. Our goal is to take politics out of a lot of these issues. If we're going to advocate, we advocate for religious liberty, the sanctity of life, marriage and educational freedom are religious liberty issues for us. And that's it. The rest we leave to you as citizens in freedom with one another. We rose to that occasion. We jumped back in because we realized that we have a role to play in the culture in which we live. You know, with First Amendment protections, I think it's a great opportunity to dare to be a Daniel today. I'll close with this thought. How many of you know of the story Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Ruth, actually, and Esther? We think of all the opportunities that people had to protect the promise in a foreign land. And I was thinking of dare to be a Daniel. Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den because the culture suddenly decides to make him illegal with a 30-day decree that suddenly makes him an enemy of the state. And it takes literally the angel of God to shut up the lions' mouths to protect Daniel from nefarious government. Well, as I was thinking about Daniel and daring to be a Daniel, I think we have it better than Daniel. He needed an angel to shut the mouths of the lions. I think that the founding fathers, through the First Amendment, tied the lions' mouths when the lions are turned towards average citizens. We've got an even greater miracle than Daniel. Put your First Amendment protections and liberties to work as you proclaim the eternal liberties of Christ. Today, the LCMS must realize that we have a responsibility, a role to play in the delineation of the government's role in our life, even as we protect the church's voice in our culture. We need to block bad interventionist government so that the state can fulfill its role and the church can be protected as well to do all that it is called to do. So I'll leave you with this thought. This is one of our phrases. Put your temporal liberties to work in service of the eternal liberties of Christ. We get to proclaim the all-inclusive grace of God in Jesus Christ alone, but thank God we get to do it in the freedoms that we have in America. May we continue to rise to the occasion of being useful in God's hands in this culture that we find ourselves in today. I think we've been given a reprieve in this last election. We'll see. But again, I don't look for Donald Trump to do our work. I just want him to keep the government where it belongs so that we can be all that we're called to be in Christ for our neighbors. And let's let the chips fall where they may. God bless you. Thank you.